Good evening, everybody, and it's great to see such a crowd here this evening. I was wondering whether anyone would turn up at all with all the lovely weather we're having, so I think it's a testament more to this wonderful building that we're all in rather than me, but it's really wonderful to see everybody here, and it's a real privilege to be invited here as well, to be just, a little part of these celebrations around the 800 years of this absolutely wonderful historic friary and its guardians, of course, the Dominican Order here in Kilkenny. So I want to start by going back to this day precisely, so the 14th of May, 1225, exactly 800 years ago. William Marshal the Younger, who of course is the founder of the Black Abbey here, or to give it its full canonical title, the Convent of the Holy and Undivided Trinity, on this day I'm pretty sure he would have been thinking about his father, also William, because this was the 6th anniversary of his death. And William the Younger had succeeded his father as both Lord Marshal of England and Earl of Pembroke, and then a year later, after the death of his mother, the great Isabel de Clare, daughter of Strongbow and Aoife, he becomes Lord of Leinster, including Kilkenny. Now, these really, really powerful titles came with these vast estates, and that combined with the absolutely legendary status of his father, William Marshal the Elder, probably the ablest and the most remarkable of all the Norman leaders. This made William the Younger, this is his effigy here, or thought to be his effigy in the Temple Church in London. This made him one of the most prominent and powerful nobles in England or Ireland. But William wasn't content to rest on his laurels, and he wanted to move up the ranks even further. He wanted to become royalty. So in 1224, then, as you do, at the age of 34, he wrangled a marriage arrangement with the 9-year-old Eleanor, who's the younger daughter of the late King John, here on the left, and his wife, Isabella de Angoulême. And what you do when you marry up in the world, especially when you have a very, very sophisticated French mother, as you can see here, she is on the left. She looks like somebody I wouldn't mess with anyway. And King John, and then this is his new brother-in-law, King Henry III, the King of England. So what do you do when you're heading up in the ranks like that? Well, of course, you go hammer and tongs trying to impress them. And this is exactly what he did. So, first of all, to remind everybody that he's from good stock, he commissions this great biography of his late father, William the Marshal, the Histoire de William le Marshal, which is this heroic tale written in Norman French that recounts his father's rags to riches story from cradle to the grave, and at the same time this manuscript is bigging up his eldest son. And to show he's a man of steel as well, which is always in favour, and an anchor of English power in Ireland, he builds castles like this one here in Ferns, and he builds Carlow Castle, and he takes on the role of Justiciar of Ireland, which is a bit like being the Prime Minister of Ireland. And he brutally puts down a rebellion by the de Lacys against the Crown in Ulster. And then, to demonstrate his piety as a devout Christian, he grants abundant gifts to the church throughout his lands in Leinster. So he grants gifts to the Cistercian Abbey here, which had been founded by his father in Graignamanagh. Same in Tintern. The Augustinians at the Hospital of St. John the Evangelist here in Kilkenny are given gifts, along with Inistioge Priory as well, the Augustinians down there in Inistioge. But to really get the nod of approval from his king and brother-in-law, in particular, he establishes here in Kilkenny a friary of Henry's new favourite order, which are the Dominicans. This order has just been established by about 8 years previously by the Castilian St. Dominic Guzman, and it's their ideology of learned friars who are preaching the word of God out in the world, as opposed to monks that are, cloistered within monasteries. In their distinctive, large black kappa and hood over a white habit, this new ideology was spreading throughout Western Christendom like wildfire. And this map here shows the amount of Dominican foundations that were established throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. In Leinster, there was 38 of them in total in Ireland by the time of the dissolution, 12 of them in Leinster. So William, I think, he's a bit like the new son-in-law arriving up to meet the in-laws with his brand new BMW. And I think we can view the foundation of the Black Abbey here in Kilkenny in 1225 as a kind of a key part of this big, grand PR campaign that William institutes to validate his ascent to royalty. And I think that's the background to why this place was established in the first place by William the Younger. And we can imagine the scene then. So the great moment when the 4.5 acre site for their new convent, it's first revealed by the Marshal, or presumably his representatives, to the Dominican friars for the very first time. And the big reveal comes, and their initial excitement, it must really have turned to complete bewilderment when they realized that what they were actually being gifted was essentially this: a wet edge of town bog on the floodplain of the River Brega. Here's a map of the former floodplain. There's the city walls of Kilkenny, and you can see all the blue here. This is the extent of the river before it was all reclaimed during the 13th and 14th century to essentially where it is today. The whole thing was kind of pushed back. And Black Abbey is slap bang on the floodplain. And this fact was, the friars were very much reminded of this pretty much on an annual basis, because this place flooded all the time. Right up to 1947, there was a massive flood here. Apparently it brought the flood levels up about 2 meters above where we are now. So, and this is the Kilkenny people from 1947, picture of the Black Abbey there. And it was flooding right up until 2002, when it was finally brought under control by Kilkenny County Council's flood relief scheme of the Nore and Brega. So thankfully at the time, the friars didn't turn around and say, thanks, but you're all right, thanks, we'll go off somewhere else. Thankfully they didn't do that. And the reason for this was because they knew that Kilkenny was a wealthy, booming new town. This was boom town in 1225. This was the capital of the Lordship of Leinster. It's home to the Marshal court here in Ireland. It's the seat of the Anglo-Norman Bishop of Ossory. And so it could provide them, as mendicants, with all the support they needed to establish, build, and then run the friary here. And here we have a map of Kilkenny, roughly at that time. You've got the castle at one end, the cathedral at the other, and here we are here. So the friars, they would have seen the great new castle which had been built by William Marshal the Elder. This was absolutely dominating the high town, so the south side of Kilkenny, with its new parish church in its shadow. And this was then beside what would have been a really bustling marketplace, where the language that was being spoken, of course, was Norman French. And then this is a reconstruction then of how we think Kilkenny Castle. This is by Dan Teach Tyler, based on archaeological excavations I've done here at the gatehouse, which have kind of given us a different view of how the Marshal Castle appeared in the early 13th century. This is by Dan Teach Tyler and myself, so that gives you an idea of the scale of William Marshal's ambition for Kilkenny. And then at the opposite end of town, the old pre-Norman monastery of St. Canice, it's long gone, and it's being replaced by an absolutely breathtaking new Gothic cathedral, which would have been pretty familiar to the friars from their homelands in the Norman world. So that's the Kilkenny that greeted the first friars here in 1225. The first thing they needed to do then was to get their site drained, obviously, and ready for building. And we know that they did this by digging a whole series of ditches to take the water away, and then they pounded hundreds, maybe thousands of oak piles into the boggy ground to form sort of a massive raft on which then they could build. And lo and behold, in 1996, archaeologists were working on the Kilkenny main drainage scheme, and they excavated dozens of these oak piles. You could clearly see them set into the peat layer 4 metres below Abbey Street, where we were on our walk a few minutes ago. So there's the Blackfern Gate, and the excavation was just here. It was a great big circular hole that was dug 4 metres down, and at the bottom of it were all these oak piles. You can see them here. They're all rammed into that peat layer. And they were dated then by dendrochronology. Guess what the date was? 1225, bang on. So that's the level of sweat and effort that went into just getting this place capable of receiving any kind of building work at all. It's quite extraordinary. So the next thing they had to do was lay out the friary. And this had to be to the prescribed Dominican claustral plan, which is basically an unroofed square cloister here. This is called the cloister court or the cloister garth, and it's then surrounded by a covered alley here. So there's an ambulatory, a walkway around the cloister, and this is all then surrounded by domestic buildings to the north of the church. So between the church here and the Brega was filled with the cloister and the domestic ranges. The key building within that range was the chapter house. This was kind of like the administrative headquarters of the friary, and that was at the centre of the east range here. And above that then you had the dormitory or the dorter, which ran its full length above. Then the refectory was up near the Brega, and that's where the community ate. It had to be opposite the church, and it was usually on the first floor, not always, but usually on the first floor above the kitchens. So you might have had the kitchens below the refectory. And then you had the west range, which had cellarage, and then an additional kind of overflow or lay brothers dormitory for additional accommodation on the west. So that's kind of the basic plan that they were working to in 1225. Here's your church, and then the cloister and all the domestic ranges around it to the north. Now, the rule of St. Augustine, it required Dominican friars to, I suppose the best way of putting it is they had to become vehicles for God, that give themselves up as chaste, obedient, and devout individuals. And they did this to the extent that within Western Christendom at that time, they were considered the superstar athletes of the Christian spiritual world. Now, Father. Daily life here was governed by the canonical hours that involved 8 services per day, beginning with matins right in the middle of the night, around midnight, and then every 3rd hour thereafter. When they weren't at service, they worked to keep the friary going, preached outside the precinct walls, which was the key difference between the Dominicans and some of the earlier monastic orders. Theirs was certainly the ultimate no-frills lifestyle as well. The food here would have been pretty monotonous based, and it was monotonous for a reason, in that was part of the package, you know. The food would have been based largely on bread with a limited range of vegetables, fish, and very occasionally some meat. Just by the way, this is a really fabulous 15th century painting of a Dominican preaching in Italy. You can see this is a scene now which would have replicated itself here in Kilkenny at the time. So that was their food, but they also had a very generous drinks allowance. They were given 8 pints of ale a day. Do you still get that? We're going to change that. So 8 pints a day, but it's not quite the party it seems, because basically it was quite a weak alcoholic ale, and it was used kind of as a Red Bull energy drink, really, basically, that helped them with the very onerous demands of getting through the day of hard work and prayer. So, back to the church here. When we look around us this evening, we get the appearance, I suppose, that we have a complete church. But really what we're seeing today is only about half the original layout. The cloister, which was to the north, and the domestic ranges around it, the chancel, which was heading off to the east there, and then a lot of the nave here as well to my right. They were, after a long period of decay, after this place was closed by Henry VIII in 1540, and then it was adapted into a courthouse. Eventually, these parts of the church were demolished in the late 18th century. So, for example, just to orientate ourselves, we're here in the south transept. There's the crossing tower. This is where the cloisters were. There's the brega down here. And the original chancel up here ran off to the east over here. And the chancel was pulled down in 1776, and it was used for building stone for the Dominicans' new convent house. And this is a photograph of the first convent house that they built here when the place was restored for Dominican worship. And then it itself then was replaced in about 1890 by the current convent. In 1778 then, the top story of the West Tower, which was over here, that was taken down to provide building stone for the re-roofing of the south transept here. So a lot of that wall there to my right is reused stone from the West Tower that was used when this was all re-roofed in 1778. And then today, as you all know, the graveyard and the wider precinct, it was all built over. Today, it's largely under car parking. Now, Ireland is blessed with about a dozen very, very well-preserved medieval mendicant houses. These are amongst the best preserved, indeed, in Europe. And amongst that, then, there's Dominican friaries, like this one here in Athenry, which was founded in 1241. There's Portumna, Lara, Strayed abbeys, and these are all fantastic examples of very well preserved Dominican friaries. And although the Kilkenny Friary here, it doesn't have quite as much surviving as those, there's still a huge amount of the medieval fabric intact. And when I started looking at this place in pulling together this talk, I kind of had an idea that there might be a little bit more to this place than meets the eye. But as I've been going through the building systematically over the last few weeks, I am blown away by the amount of new fabric that is still here, the amount of new discoveries that have been made. Most of them have never been published, and there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye, I think. So what do we have? Well, from the medieval period, we have the nave here, the nave arcade here. This is the plan of, kind of a simplified plan of the medieval church. We have the nave arcade, the west tower, the chancel is gone, the crossing tower here still survives, and this arcade here for the south transept and this wall here are original medieval. That wall is rebuilt. That wall is a 19th century rebuild, the north wall of the nave. Much of the south wall of the nave, and probably most of it actually, is also rebuilt. So that's the gist of the building. Now, there's also a very important collection here of at least 32 medieval funerary monuments, and they tell their own story, and I'll talk about them a little bit more in a minute. As I was going through the place here, myself and my partner Ida, we were after finding at least 6 new funerary monuments belonging to the Middle Ages that haven't been previously identified. The thing we don't have really are surviving historical records that tell us about how the building was put together, the different phases of it, and which bits came before other bits. And we have to rely then on some later drawings like this one, this Gabriel Berenger view of the south transept from about 1770. And then there's this absolutely beautifully detailed and very, very accurate watercolour, which is in Gross's Antiquities, and it's by a man called Brian. That's his surname. It dates from about 1775, and we're so lucky to have this because this was done literally months before the chancel was taken down. So this is all gone now, and we have this image of it here thanks to whoever Brian was. We have another print, another watercolour from Gross's Antiquities, and this shows you can see here there's no roof on the place at that time. So there's the south transept where you're all sitting. There's the nave arcade here, and there's the piers here. So you can see it's completely roofless in 1775. You might note too as well that here's the kids absolutely wrecking Daddy's head when he's trying to do a bit of work. John Roke's map then from 1758, it also gives an impression of what the general kind of pre-demolition layout of this place was. You can see Roke shows the chancel. This is probably the cloister range to the north, and you can see the south transept. Anything that's blank is roofless. So you can see the entire place was roofless in 1758. Just these buildings up to the north here had roofs on. So Roke shows where something has a roof, he stipples it in like that. The other source of information we have in trying to put this place together and unpick its history are archaeological investigations. So there's been out 16 different archaeological digs out in the precinct, and there's some really significant ones have been done in the graveyard by Martin Reid, John Channing and Patrick Neary of this parish. And the late Ryan O'Flynn then excavated out in the former chancel in 1977. Frank Ryan and Mary Henry also excavated a small portion of the east end of the chancel in 2000. And then there's been a geophysical survey done that was done around the time of the flood relief scheme by Joanna Lee in 2004 in the area of the former cloister. So that's sort of the big pool of information that we kind of have to dip into to try and figure out the story of this place. And what I've been doing then over the last, there's just the map showing the different archaeological investigations that have been done here. So the green here is the geophysical survey, and there's Patrick's big excavation in the car park. What I've been doing here over the past few weeks, myself and my partner Ida, we've been literally crawling around every inch of this building, trying to unpick its story. And thank you, Father Damien, for all your hospitality and for giving us the full access, all areas to this wonderful building. And for not mentioning the time we'd gotten ourselves locked into the tower, only to discover after a good while and a load of panicked phone calls that we were trying to open entirely the wrong door. Thanks for not telling anyone about that.
I lost the money.
So that's where we're at. So we've got all this previous information and we've a bit of new information. And where does that lead us to? It leads us to this phase plan, which is my current interpretation. This is far from the final word on this place, on the development of the church over the last 315 years of its existence up to the dissolution in 1540. And really, I suppose there's four key building phases. You've got the black is what's left of the first phase, the 1225 church. You can see very, very little of it is still surviving. A little bit on the west wall. Then you've got two walls here which were excavated by Ryan O'Flynn. That's the first phase. Second phase then, in the late 13th century, you've got this south aisle arcade, which would have replaced the original south aisle wall. Third phase then, so that make the nave bigger. Then third phase is the addition of the great south transept here with its absolutely spectacular south window. And that's all the red. I think at the same time they built the west tower up against the outside of the west wall of the church, which would have blocked the window, but it created kind of a porch entrance into the nave of the church. And then the fourth and final key phase during the Middle Ages happens maybe 20 or 30 years before this place is shut down, and that's the insertion of the great crossing tower here, which you all can see from the outside as well. That's the blue. And then there's the 18th century work. So the transept here is re-roofed. That wall is built in around 1778. And then there's the 19th century restoration and re-roofing of the nave here. So just to fly very quickly through those different phases. The first church that was built here around 1225, it would have been the typical mendicant church with this big, long, narrow nave and a big, long chancel. So the black, just to explain, the grey is all the different phases together, and the black is the first phase, okay? So there's our chancel, west door, big, long, narrow church. And at its east end here, that's where the high altar would have been sited. And we know from the 1775 view that it was lit by triplet of lancet windows. So these big, long, high, pointed lancet windows. And there presumably then would have been similar windows on the north and south walls of the chancel as well. So go forward about 50 years then, the friars, they need more space for preaching. They're becoming more and more important here in Kilkenny. They need loads more space, preaching, for chantry chapels, and these are where wealthy families paid a chaplain. Well, they paid the friars here to basically sing masses for the deceased in order to speed their passage through purgatory. And also they needed more space for burial inside the church. So what do? They extend the nave here to the south, and they would have replaced the original south wall with this lovely nave arcade of pretty rough sandstone columns. They would have all been plastered originally, and they've got quite plain. So yeah, there's the extension of the nave, quite plain capitals on them, which are recreated now in cement, but you can see them from the 1775 view. That's the capitals there, okay. And that's deliberate. There's no fancy stuff here at that time. It's all very austere, the architecture. It's all meant, the idea is that there's no distractions. You're here for one purpose, and that's one purpose only, and that's to hear and experience the Word of God. And the success of the Dominicans here, as elsewhere then, it leads in about 1375 then to another major expansion. So about 100 years later, they add on this massive and elaborate, what's called a preaching transept. This is added to the south. This place would have been filled with side altars, chantry chapels, burial monuments. It would have been absolutely crammed. Remember, there were no pews here. Everybody stood, and the place would have been absolutely crammed. Remember, 1375 to about 1400, this is the height of what's called the chantry movement, and this comes in after the Black Death pandemic, which is 1348 to 1349. Black Death comes along, and it wipes out half the population of Kilkenny, including, according to Friar Clin, 8 friars in the community here. The transept then, of course, was lit by probably the most spectacular stained glass window of the late Gothic decorated style which was ever constructed in Ireland. The glass that's in it at the moment is 19th century, but we're quite certain that it would have had a really, really spectacular stained glass in it during the 14th century and 15th century. So you had that great south window. There was also 5 similar but smaller windows here in the east wall of the south transept. 1, 2, 3, 4. You'll notice one of them is missing. That was originally here. You can just see the outline of it, and it was stolen and is now set up. I should say it was stolen in about the mid-18th century and was set up in a Church of Ireland church somewhere in Dublin. I've been trying to track it down, haven't had much luck yet. If anybody ever tracks it down, do let me know, and we'll call up with we'll tell them we want it back. So you had 5 spectacular late Gothic decorated style windows over here. Probably had maybe 3, 4 of them over here as well on the west wall. And when the sun shone, this place must have been absolutely, there's deniers pictures of some of the windows. Yeah, this place must have been a spectacular vision of colour and what was considered divine light filling the space here. Ultimately, this is alluding to the French Rayonnette style, which reaches its pinnacle with the great La Chapelle of King Louis, which was built between 1241 and 1248. This is built by Louis IX in Paris as an enormous reliquary, essentially, to house the relics of the crown of thorns and other passion relics. So this is what is in the mind of the people, the friars, who designed this south transept. Now, also around this time, perhaps a little later, they built the double-vaulted West Tower belfry, and this doubles as a porch, and that's built up against the original west wall and window. So the ironic thing about that, though, is they build the tower over here, and it blocks all the light coming in from the west window. So it gets much darker in the nave, but this place explodes with light and colour, which is interesting in its own way. In around 1500 then, during the episcopacy of the last pre-Reformation Dominican bishop of Ossory, a man called Oliver Cantwell, a crossing belfry tower then is inserted between the nave and the transept. So there's the nave, there's our transept here, and a great big rectangular crossing tower is plunked right in there. It's 3 stories over a vault, and the underside of the vault over the choir here, which was at the time called the Friars' Walking Place, this was decorated with very, very elaborate rib vaulting. And you wouldn't know it, but most of this actually dates from about 1977, would you believe? So the responds here are all original. They're from the 16th century, but this is all a recreation in timber by a master joiner here from Kilkenny in the 1970s. I haven't been able to track down his name, but he was a spectacularly good carpenter. And so he built all of this back in the 1970s. It's probably a fairly accurate representation of what was there originally, and it, I'm sure, is very familiar to many of you because it certainly echoes the crossing vaulting, the Lierne vaulting up in St. Canice's Cathedral. We also have some very, very fine corbels then up along that are supporting the vaulting, and they're decorating the walking place. And they've the very, very fine leaf foliage, which is probably, I think it's so close to what we are finding on tombs that are the product of the O'Tunney school of monumental sculptures, that I'm pretty certain that the famous O'Tunney's, probably Rory O'Tunney, he had a hand in building the crossing tower here. And very, very helpfully, we have a commemorative plaque in the southeast pier over there. It asks for soul prayers for James Shortall, he's the Baron of Ballylarkin and Ballykeefe, and his wife is Catherine White. And as it says in Latin on the plaque, they gave the workmen employed in the erection of this tower their daily pay from the beginning to the end. So they paid for it, and they're commemorated, and they're getting prayers for their hard work. Now, rather unhelpfully though, the date of the work is left out, but it has to have been sometime before James died in 1527, and we know that because here's his effigial tomb in St. Canice's Cathedral, which has his date of death on it. And while himself and his missus get all the credit for building basically the entire tower, I'm pretty sure it actually incorporates part of a good chunk of an earlier tower. Myself and Ida were going through it there the other day, and it's quite clear that there's an earlier tower there. Now, it still needs to be unpicked a bit. So I think they might be taking a little bit more credit than they're due. You'll notice as well, there's all this lovely punch dressing on the surfaces of the piers and the arches. And the idea behind this was that was meant to fix the plaster for frescoes. And part of one of those frescoes was found in 1975, just on the north side of the crossing, the opposite side to where we are now. And apparently, it's gone now, unfortunately, but there is a record of it in the Kilkenny Archaeological Society archive that I've been trying to chase up. And I suppose that's important because that reminds us that the entire church would have been completely covered in frescoes. You wouldn't have seen any stone, rubble, masonry here whatsoever. Everything would have been rendered and then painted, and there would have been full of religious paintings of, you know, the resurrection and the doom and all this sort of stuff. Now, I'm just going to go through some of the kind of lesser known maybe features that have, a lot of them are new discoveries that have been made over the last few weeks from the church here. And the first protocol, we're going to go back to the chancel. We're outside the railing here, and you'll notice that on the ground here you've got the outline of the east end of the chancel, and that reflects the excavation that was done there in 2000 by Frank Ryan. What did he find there? Well, he found the north and south wall and the east wall here, and tagged onto the north wall was the part of a little chapel with this beautifully tiled floor. Set right up against the east wall, there was a human skeleton, and we have a plan of what they found here. So there's the east end of the chancel, there's the chapel, there's skeleton, and then there's this funny little thing here. It was a fireplace. It was interpreted at the time as a fireplace, but I'm pretty sure it's a thing called an obli, which is a wafer oven. It's where the Holy Communion at the time, the wafer bread for the celebration, that's where that was baked. Communion wafers at the time, they were basically miniature versions of your everyday unleavened kind of heart cakes, I suppose we call them today. And there was a big row in the 11th century between Western Christendom and the Eastern Church over whether communion bread should be sourdough or whether it should be unleavened. And this blew up into an absolutely enormous war between the two sides of the church. So the Western Church adopted the unleavened bread, and the Eastern Church, today, still up to today, still has the sourdough communion. And here's an intact one of these wafer ovens. This is I was over looking at this there a few months ago in Durham Cathedral. So it's basically a little oven they're usually set into the south wall of the chancels. And a view here of Christ receiving communion. Now, excavations by Ryan O'Flynn then in the further up along the chancel, then he found just about here below the window, he found 2 stone-lined graves empty of their skeletons, and then an intact skeleton over here beside them. If we go now to the west end of the nave over here, and you can see, so there's where our original west window was, right? And that tower then was plonked up against that. But I'm pretty sure that's reflecting the splay for the original window. And then down below that, that sandstone arch there reflects where the original west door of the main entrance for the lay community, that's where they entered during the Middle Ages. That's a detail of it there. The stone door case itself is gone, as you can see there. So all you're left with is the outline of the rear arch. But there's a very interesting fragment in the Friary garden. You can see it here. You can see the lovely stiff leaf on it. And it's absolutely identical to the part of the door case for the west door of St. Canice's Cathedral. This is a conjoined, foliated stiff leaf capitals with these shafts then. So that's what it would have looked like originally. I'm pretty sure that's from the original west door. Into the late 13th century nave arcade over here then, and what's turned up are literally dozens, as we've gone through when you kind of shine a light, raking up the stonework, you pick out all these little V's, and they're incised onto the stone voussoirs. And what these are masons' marks. This is how the masons how they used to quantify the piecework here by the stone cutters. So the master mason, he was keeping tabs on what everybody was producing, and as the quality of the work was signed off by the master mason, he put a V onto etched a V onto the stone, and you can see literally dozens of them over there on the nave arcades. Into the south transept here, and it's really worth taking a few minutes to look closely at the great south window. As I said, this is the pinnacle of the decorated style, and you can see it's decorated with these cusps and intersecting tracery. It's got so there's your intersecting tracery, which forms the framework of it. Pointed trefoils. You've got your hood moulding then kind of around the top of the window. And basically, it's divided into a lower part where you've got these thin vertical mullions, and then there's 7 different levels of decorative work then above that. And the whole thing is then topped off by a little OG-headed oculus there on the top of the south gable. And the next time you're out there, have a good look up at the very, very top, at the apex of the hood moulding, and you'll see that there's a bishop's head stone, a stone head portrait up there. He's wearing the usual kind of rectangular mitre with a pedimented top of the time, and there's a lovely little decorative strap then around the base of his mitre. And he's wearing the chasuble then, which is the mass vestment for the bishop. I think he might be missing his right arm as well. You can just see the butt of it here. And so typically his right arm would be out in blessing. And we look up then, you don't need to turn around because it's on the screen, but the top left of the window on the inside there, we find there's another identical, beautifully executed bishop's head up there, forming the base of a capital of the rear arch up there, and above the shaft here has been replaced in timber. There's the medieval bishop's head under a stiff leaf canopy, and very, 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 very difficult to see that at all. You can barely see it from this level, and thank you very, very much to Johnny Barrett who photographed these especially for me. They're really, really superb photos that have just given us a whole new insight into these. Either side of the bishop's head then you've got 3 rosettes, and they signify devotion to the Virgin Mary. So why are there 2 bishop's heads shown on the window? Could they commemorate the fact that the patron was a bishop? It's possible, very, very possible. Or it could simply be that this is the bishop who was in place. This was the window was executed during his tenure. So there's a bit of a mystery there, and it's something I would like to follow up. I think there is a possibility that because there's two of them, usually you only get one. It might have been a Dominican bishop called John of Tatterhall, who's around at the same time as that style of architecture is in vogue, and he's the Bishop of Ossory in the mid-1300s, only for a short period. I think he's from in the late 1350s, and maybe, just maybe, he's the man who paid for the fabulous south window. Now, if we go to the end of the south aisle here, south transept aisle, you'll see again there's a mason's mark on the capital. Unlike the very kind of rough and ready mason's marks, which are all about quality control over here, this mason's mark was done by somebody who was very, very, very proud of their work. And they wanted to leave their individual mark on the capital. So that's right down the end there, and the respond at the very, very end to the arcade there. On the outside, you'll all have passed this loads of times, I'm sure, and it certainly always kind of puzzled me as to what is going on here. You've got this circular oculus window and then this rectangular slot which has been blocked up by a reused medieval fragment of a reused medieval cross slab. I always assumed that this had been these two, so the oculus and this rectangular slot had been kind of just, rebuilt into the wall during the 18th or 19th century restorations. But then I went and I had a look. Sorry, that's just a close-up. You can see the cross slab. Had a good look at our 1775 painting, and lo and behold, there they are. So there's the oculus. Now it's slightly in the wrong place, but I'd say that's just a mistake by the artist. And there's the cross. So that puts a completely different perspective on it. That tells us that they were here before all of the restoration work took place here from the 18th century onwards. And then if we look at the interior elevation, there's a rear arch there from a medieval window. And that would have been at the end of an aisle. So at the end of this aisle here, there would have been another window just there, which presumably was of the same style as our great south transept window here. But it's been blocked up. The window is removed and then it's replaced by a wall containing the hatch and the oculus opening. And both these are now blocked, but there's also down there at the end, you'll see there's an offset or a ledge for a floor level. So there's the rear arch for the medieval window. There's your oculus coming through. You can see it there. It's blocked now. And there's that offset level that I was telling you about. So this is all clearly, deliberately built at this location. And what I'm suggesting is that this was a purpose-built, bricked up cell within the church for an anchorite or an anchoress. These were the religious recluses, they were hermits, mystics, and they devoted themselves to solitude, to prayer and meditation, and they lived and were buried in a single stone room, which is called an anchorhold, and this is usually tagged onto the side of the church. And with generally these anchorholds, they have a single shuttered slit or hatch. They often have one small little window to let a little bit of light in, and the hatch is used by people, as you can see in this medieval illustration of an anchorhold. It was used by people to consult with the anchorite, to get their wisdom and to offer them gifts and alms. And these anchorholds, they bring huge prestige to the church. And indeed, we have Bishop David Roth. He's writing about the Diocese of Ossory in the 1640s, And he tells us that there was loads of anchorholds in the diocese at that time. We know that there were up in St. Canice's Cathedral on the north side of the choir. There's one in Freshford, possibly another one in Kilkenny as well. And then we find examples in Dominican houses, like there's one in the Friary in Galway. There was another one in Youghal as well. So my suggestion is that there was an anchorhold just where the statue of our Lord is at the south side of the aisle there. So if we leave our south transept now, we're going to head out the door into the west belfry, tower and porch. One of the most remarkable things about the west tower is that there's a set of at least 9 13th century grave slabs that are rebuilt, used as building stone within the west tower. There's two of them are forming the jambs of the main entrance doors. Here's your west tower, lovely ogee window above the door. The door then is kind of acting as a porch. That's how you got into the west end of the church, into the nave. Go in here, turn right, come out that door there. And the opposing jambs are actually reused medieval cross slabs. Now, you can't really see them very well on that photo. It's very, very difficult to see. You need good light, but they are definitely medieval grave slabs, and the decorative cross with the fleur-de-lis, which is very, very typical of them, has all been kind of chiselled out. But you can just about make them out. And then go up into the tower and into the stairwell roof. You'll see there's 5 of them have been reused here. So that's kind of looking down the stairs, and you look up at the roof, and there's this absolutely amazing display of medieval funerary sculpture. These have never been outside, so they've never been weathered like most of these grave slabs are. So the carving on them is just so beautifully crisp, and the inscriptions, you can read them here, Hic Jacet and Pro Pio, which is, we don't know the name of the person, but it's Hic Jacet, here lies, pray for somebody. If we had a little poke in here, we might be able to get the name. But in the 15th century, they're clearing out 200-year-old grave slabs from the church here and reusing them as gravestones, as building stones. Some of the steps in the tower are also reused grave slabs. Here's one of them here, well polished from years and years of feet going up and down the stairs. There's also a couple of vaulted cells, and have that very typical late medieval wicker centering at second floor level. And I wonder, are these cells possibly also anchorholds? We'll go back out the tower and we'll look up, and there's a funny little stone here which is rebuilt into the south side of the nave here. That one there. Have a closer look at it, and you can see there's a hole in the middle. This was spotted by Ida. A hole in the middle, and there's a line coming off here. And it's equivalent. This is a thing called a scratch dial. And basically, these were a way, a bit like a sundial, these were a way of keeping track of the canonical hours here within the community. And you can see that's how they worked. There's your Franciscan, and he's putting his, what was called the gnomon, which is like a decorative stick, basically, into the hole, and wherever the shadow is cast, each of these lines doesn't represent a time. It represents a time during the canonical day, which is when a mass needs to be said or a service needs to be attended. You might wonder, okay, fine, that's how they told the time when it was sunny. What did they do when it was nighttime or when it wasn't sunny? Well, they had these things called candle clocks, and they stuck nails into the side of the candle. They knew what rate the candle would melt, and the nails would fall out, and that told them that it was a particular time of day. So they're very, very clever. Another new discovery is built into one of the buttresses, which was put up against the west wall here of the nave in 1936. And this is a fragment of blind arcading with trefoil-headed windows and quatrefoils. Now, initially, I thought that this was part of a decorated sarcophagus, like the ones that are on the entrance there. But it has a flat back, and it's actually far more likely to be part of a 13th or 14th century shrine. And we find very, very similar fragments to these there's one in Goran, you can see here. This is in Clare, Galway, and a good parallel for how one of these shrines looked in its complete state is the shrine of St. Thomas of Cantilupe in Hereford Cathedral here, so I think our fragment here comes from the lower tier here of a very elaborate shrine that was set up here within the church, probably in the 13th or 14th century. The friars also would have had loads of statues here. This place would have been absolutely coming down with statues. Every chapel, every altar, every chantry chapel here had one or two, maybe more statues. And we have 3 medieval examples still surviving. There's one post-Reformation, one maybe 17th century, which is still to be seen in the Friary here. Of course, there's the famous 15th century alabaster statue, which is probably made in Bristol, and this represents the throne of grace. And you can see this God the Father, the Holy Spirit, and they're in a vertical formation with Christ on the cross. And very, very similar to an example that we also find in Callan in County Kilkenny. Now, one of the things that has puzzled people for yonks is the 1264 date on the statue. You can see it's carved in here. It's in an archaic kind of script, so it wasn't done in the 20th century anyway, but it's not there in 1842 when this illustration is done of the statue. You can see it's missing. So it was done sometime between 1842, probably shortly after that, I think, just by looking at the form of the script. What's happening in 1264 that somebody took it upon themselves to carve that date onto our statue here? Hard to know. It's possible that it's commemorating the foundation of Archaeology Friary, which is founded in 1264. And there are links between this place and Wicklow post-Reformation up until the 19th century with the Teent family of Wicklow. Another possibility, there's a Dominican saint, Jane of Orvieto, and she's born in 1264. So there's 2 possibilities as to why that date is there that I would suggest. Anyone has a better suggestion, I'd love to hear it. There's also the famous oak statue then of the Dominican friar. We don't know exactly how old this. It would be very interesting to get it scientifically dated. It's been repainted, so it's kind of hard to figure out exactly how old it is, and messed around with a bit. Apparently Cromwell had a right go at him. But you can see that he has the typical Dominican dress on with the black kappa and the tunic and the scapular and the belt, as on the medieval painting there on the right. And he also has sockets for his arms. So originally the statue would have had arms, which presumably would have been in blessing. A couple of other statues then. There's the Catherine of Alexandria. She's the patroness of philosophers, and she is adopted by the Dominican order as well. A lovely polished limestone statue of Catherine, and in the mid-19th century we know that this was set up in a statue niche above what was then the main entrance into the church, which was here. There was an end after the window was taken. A porch was set up on the other side of the wall, and that was the entrance into the south transept here. And there you can see in a little niche, there's Catherine of Alexandria. Also in the convent house, we find there's a timber Madonna and Child. Traditionally, this is thought to have come from Rinuccini's ship. We're not quite sure about that. It's probably more likely that it was a donation from some wealthy benefactor. There's a very similar one in Thomastown as well. And all of these statues would have been originally set into very elaborate statue niches, which had these decorated canopies above them. And there's a fragment, a really, really fine example, which hasn't been previously recognized. So of a very large fragment of a large 15th century statue niche, and it's in the garden on the other side of the wall here. Beautifully carved, absolutely beautifully carved, with all this micro architecture of buttresses. So these are representing Gothic buttresses with lancet windows and pointed arches, and then there's crockets here and ball finials. So there's your buttresses. Carved into that, then you've got your lancet windows. So it's a really, really beautiful piece. And then the underside of the canopy, it's now inverted, has carvings that are representing rib vaulting. So you can see those ribs there, and there's a central boss then from which the ribs radiate. And if we go to the Rock of Cashel, look at the west end of the Cathedral of the Rock, you'll see statue niches there. So that's the idea. So whether this particular one was on the outside or the inside, not sure. It would be very interesting to try and track it down. And then a very similar alabaster example of one of these, which is quite similar to our one here, and it just shows you what they were thinking. This is from Italy. This is top of the range statue canopy from Italy, and you can see clear similarities between the two. Out to the cloister, there's no upstanding remains of the cloister or any of the domestic ranges, apart from one fragment of a very much reconstructed medieval window that's looking out onto the Brega. Any of you who were on the walk will have seen it earlier on. But the general outline of the cloisters is on Roke's map here on the left, and it's also on the first edition Ordnance Survey map. So it's extending between the church and the River Brega. And what happened was, after the friary was shut by Henry VIII, what happens? Well, the leading citizens of the town in the corporation, remember they're Catholic, they want to get a piece of the action. They know Henry is going to shut down the place. They want a piece of the pie. And they write a letter to Thomas Cromwell, who is the king's great enforcer, and they offer him £222, which in today's money, I've worked out, it's about €110,000 or so for the building here and all its land, which, I don't think you'd sell it today for 110,000. It's what's interesting about this, there's a property grant that goes with that transaction, and that has some references to the buildings that are in the cloister and talks about, have them underlined there. There's a dormitory, a small tower, which is presumably the West Tower. There's a chapter house, there's the King's Chamber, and there's a few cellars, chambers, and kitchens, and all that sort of thing. And all that area is now under gardens. But in 2004, there was this geophysical survey that I talked about earlier on that was done, and it identified the very, very typical small Dominican cloister garth here. So that's the red line here. So they picked up a good bit of that. And as well as that, then they picked up some of the domestic buildings that were ranged around the cloister. It would have looked something like this back in the day. A covered alley with an arcade of unglazed windows looking out into the court. This is Sligo Abbey, so from the 15th century cloister colonnade. Now, from Kilkenny, one of the real puzzles about this place is, what did the cloister look like? And we've no good evidence for it. All we have is, there's a reference which John Prim published in 1851, where he talks about it having, the colonnade had flat-headed windows with mullions and transoms. That to me sounds like it's a much later style of cloister arcade than what's shown here. That would be typical maybe of a post-Reformation cloister arcade. Was the cloister rebuilt when this place went back into Dominican ownership during the Confederation of Kilkenny? That's just the sort of thing that they would do, you know, rebuild the cloister. The geophysics also identified the remains of some of the conventual buildings then around it, around the cloister, probably the chapter house, and then parts of the refectory is up here at the north, running parallel to the church. And that medieval window on the brega here is probably the west end of the refectory building. And typically the community would have washed their hands in this part of the cloister range. They would have washed it after eating at the thing called the communal lavatorium. And we have this amazing grant from the Bishop of Ossory, Geoffrey de Tourneville. It still survives today. You can go and see it in the Medieval Mile Museum, dating from 1244 or so. And he's granting them the water from Kenny's Well, which, do I have a picture? No, I don't, sorry. From Kenny's Well, which is a medieval well about 500 or 600 metres from here, via a pipe. So he says that you can take water out of my well, but it has to be via a pipe that is 24 millimetres wide. And the pipe can't be any wider than this little ring here, which he attaches then to the grant. And that's the extent of the pipe. So there must have been a lead pipe, 24 millimetres wide, running from Kenny's Well to the lavatorium here in the Friary. I think overall then the cloister and the domestic ranges, it probably would have been quite similar to what they have in Kilmallock today. So you had basically, here's your nave and chancel, south transept. This is all Kilmallock. Cloister to the north, refectory up here, all your main buildings to the east of the cloister, and then to the west you had your lay dormitories and stuff like that. Now the tombs of the special dead. They were inside the church here, and we have these really interesting accounts going back right to the 16th century that probably the most special dead of the whole lot of them, some of the Marshals, were actually buried here. That William Marshal the Younger was buried here, and his brother Richard. Now, William definitely wasn't buried here. He was buried in the Temple Church in London. He died after getting food poisoning at his sister's wedding in 1231. I'd love to be in a fly on the wall when that cook was being hauled up for a chat after that happened. But he's definitely buried with his father in the Temple Church in London. This is thought to be his effigy in the Temple Church. There's a bit of controversy over whether it is actually him or not. But I think there are more solid grounds for saying that Richard Marshal was actually buried here. He dies after a battle on the Curragh in 1234, and there's an account of his burial here preserved in the Chartularies of St. Mary's in Dublin that describes his burial here. Now, if he was buried here, he would certainly be in the prime position, which was to the north of the high altar, probably in a very elaborate tomb niche with an elaborate effigy over his burial. Could he be there? We don't know. It's quite possible though. And then we have this other really intriguing account written in 1571 by a man called Meredith Hamner, and he describes the tombs of 18 knights here. And he says they've all been bashed around bar one, which he describes, and I quote him, and I've underlined it there, as one stone whereupon the picture of a knight is portrayed, bearing a shield about his neck, wherein the Cantwell arms are insculpted. Now, that might ring a bell with some of you. Could he be talking about this, probably the most famous medieval piece of funerary sculpture in the country, which of course is the Cantwell Fada Knight effigy at Kilfane. I have to say, it's always struck me as a bit weird that Cantwell Fada is out here in this small parish church in Kilfane. It's a strange place to have such a very high status burial like that. And we do know certainly that there were other members of the Cantwell family are buried here, including Bishop Cantwell. They may have had a dynastic burial chapel here, and it's possible that the Kilfane effigy was originally from here, and then it was moved out to Kilfane, after the 1570s, after Hamner was here. There's the remains of about 32 other medieval funerary monuments here. None of them are in their original positions. The finest of them is this absolutely wonderful effigy of a woman. She's out there at the entrance, and she's dressed in this big long gown of tubular pleats, and she has these things called poke sleeves, and there's these lovely little decorative ribbons shown on here, and her hands are clasped in prayer. Now, when she was first discovered in 1851, she had her head. It was detached, but she had it. Unfortunately, it's now missing. If anybody has this woman's head on their mantelpiece, I'd love to know, okay? Near her then, there's a female head slab, and showing a woman wearing the very typical hat for the piece of headgear for the 13th century called the barbette. You can see the barbette there, and there's a contemporary illustration of what that would have looked like. And then, of course, there's these 4 big blocks of limestone, trapezoidal blocks that have been hollowed out, and these were used for holding the corpse. The corpse probably would have been embalmed and placed in here. And you'll see if you look closely at each of the sarcophagi, they've got these little holes down the bottom, and they're soak holes to take away all the gunk. So they would have been, some of them would have been laid above ground level here within the church, and then some of them would have been sunk down into the ground, and a very nice slab then put on top of them, maybe an effigy or one of those coffin-shaped cross slabs. There's a lovely decorated one then as well. It's one of only, I think, 3 decorated sarcophagi from the country, and it's got, similar to the shrine fragment, it's got these lovely quatrefoil panels and niches and things. So that's how the elite were treated in death. They were given burial here inside the church in all this fancy funeral gear. But for the rest of the population, including, I would say, all but the leading friars here in the community, burial would have taken place outside in the graveyard. And the excavations that I've already mentioned by Martin Reed in 1996 produced 261 individual skeletons, and this still remains to this day that the largest population, the largest sample of the medieval population that we have from the country. And there's been some really interesting archaeological analysis done on the 261 remains by a fabulous osteoarchaeologist called Loreen Buckley, and she has shown that females only made up about 1/3 of the population that was sampled, and that suggests that many of these people may well have been friars here. She also found out that life expectancy, which generally in the medieval period is very, very low, maybe 30, 35 was as far as you got. Only 10% of this excavated population had reached old age. And in osteoarchaeological terms, that's 46. So only 10% of them had gotten to 46. Most of the people, they were buried head to the west in simple earth-cut graves, presumably wrapped up in shrouds. But there's also a number of quite unusual interments. There's a pair of young men there on the left. They're buried with their faces down, so they're prone. And then there's one guy, and he's buried on his side. There's also two men who had clearly met very, very gruesome deaths, and they had been buried with their hands bound behind their backs. And you can see clearly here, particularly on this one, to see the way his hands are, they're behind his back like this. So he was bound and then thrown into a grave. Another interesting thing that came out of Martin's excavation was an 11-metre long section of the Friary's stone precinct wall. So the entire precinct was ringed by a very, very high and thick, probably battlemented precinct wall. And Martin found a good stretch of it at the junction of Black Mill Street and Abbey Street. And as well as being high and thick, it also had a big base batter going down to the bottom of the wet ground which was outside it. And that reminds us that this place needed to be protected. You know, the Dominicans ultimately, and particularly in the earlier years, they're an integral part of the English conquest of Ireland. And on that, we often hear that the Friary was built outside the town wall, but in fact, it's the other way around. The Friary, of course, was here 25 years before the town wall was built. And when they came to build the town wall, they must have been rightly scratching their heads, because they ended up having to do a kind of a zigzag around the precinct. So there's the precinct wall, a reconstruction of it here. This was done on behalf of Kilkenny County Council by myself and an artist, working with an artist called Philip Armstrong. And you can see there's the precinct wall, there's the town wall, and instead of just going straight up here, they had to zigzag around here to the Abbey Gate over here, and then head over towards the Brega. And actually we find a very similar thing at a number of other mendicant houses, like in Cashel as well. So today, our Black Abbey is the only one of the 38 medieval Dominican houses that's still been used for its original purpose, which, as Father Damien alluded to earlier on. And the past is not dead, I would say. It's alive, and it's happening here in this fabulous friary. And since 1225, Kilkenny has gained so much from the Dominicans, and I'd venture to say that the order has also gained so much from Kilkenny too. This place remains an absolutely vital part of our cultural, our archaeological, and our faith heritage. And it's certainly deserving, I think, of the travel writer William Rufus Chetwood's 1746 opinion that it was, in its glory, equal to any that I have seen. So I'll finish up there. All remains for me to do then is to wish you in the Dominicans a very, very happy birthday, and to wish this great old church a very, very happy birthday. And if Father Damien would like to bring out the cake with 800 candles in it, that would be wonderful. So before I finish up, I really need to thank a few people. I'd like to thank Father Tom and Eileen Summer-Ronan and Kilkenny Archaeological Society for inviting me to give this talk in the first place, to Father Damien and Father Joe for just opening up the friary here and for being so generous with their time and accommodating, to my partner Ida for all her amazing help over the last few weeks, my daughter as well, Bea, she helped with some of the photography. Fonzie Mealy very, very kindly provided a really good scan of that absolutely wonderful gross print from 1775, and Johnny Barrett then for the really superb photos of the two bishops. Philip Kenny did the digitising of the phased archaeological plan. And finally, just thank you all very, very much for listening. Thank you very much.